Hi. Sure. All right. No, thank you.
Nice to meet you. Great to have you
Yeah,
here.
thanks for having me. Yeah, first time, but yeah, it's great to meet everybody. Looking forward to meeting the students.
Yeah, good. Um, I think
Mm-hmm.
that I'm going to be introducing you.
Okay. This time not around, or?
Yes. I don't know if he's here or not. His wife got really ill last
Really?
night, and
Yeah, it's really
so
bad.
he's not sure if there's
Okay.
so you go by Raj,
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
and
If I get the lighting right, I did ask them for the first set of eyes and that's
you know, he has
indirectly, I'm pretty much responsible.
no, but I mean,
Actually, this project is start where you're
Good to see you. Yeah. How long have you been here?
more than
1 year. Okay. How do you like it? Good. Yeah.
and a bunch of artists.
Okay. Nice. Okay. Yeah, I can see you. Yeah. Yeah.
Check, check, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, check, check.
Anyway, over the past couple of weeks, we've been
Yeah.
fussing with the lighting.
I'm just gonna shut that off and when you're ready, turn it on.
Okay.
You're doing the intro.
I'm,
And then if you don't mind, just push
I
it to the
see.
side.
All right, fine.
Thank you very much.
But do you want? So he doesn't need it, but it might be good if he.
Good, yeah, we'll fix it up. Sure.
Okay, all right.
Besides that, yeah. I don't think they'll mind either for the streaming.
Okay.
Okay, good. I just want to make sure the ceiling mics. Okay, disabled. All right,
Is
great.
the
Thank you.
audio on? So I have a few sort of.
Oh yeah, you're plugged in. Can we do something like on YouTube? Just a quick.
You mean a test?
Yeah.
And this one has audio.
Oh yeah, famous human. Yeah, that's good.
Yep.
That's good?
All
Okay.
right, great.
It's working.
Excellent.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
I gotta have you moving so man, especially here in Harvard.
That's right. That's right. It is across the river. That's
Right.
right. So you have a pretty full dance card, right? I mean, there are a lot of people who
Yeah, yeah.
are interested in meeting you.
I mean, there's. I guess I'm not going to talk at all about the brain-machine interface work that I do
Yeah,
in directing
right.
a center on neurotech and
Right,
all that stuff.
yeah.
So, yeah, if people are interested in that, we can definitely chat
Yeah,
about that.
good.
It's mostly on the theory aspects.
Sounds great.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to it. I don't know if you knew that Adrian was here.
Oh yeah, I heard
last
about
week.
that. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I mean, it was
right.
complete accident.
Yeah.
We scheduled you,
I see,
whenever
okay.
that was.
Okay.
And she was more recently by a different. Actually, she was in town for a different
I
thing.
see. She go talk here also?
Yeah,
Yeah.
but then we
Yeah.
snuck her in here.
Okay.
Actually, in place of one of the student
Ah,
presentations.
I see.
But she gave a talk here also.
Great, great.
So do you guys teach that course every year? or is it
Which one?
is it just you, or the Coursera?
The Coursera one, yeah. I mean,
equivalent one?
we just gave it once, right? I mean,
I see.
it's now running monthly. Like every month it's being offered, and
I
there's
see.
new batch
But
of students.
locally for you?
Oh, locally it's once every couple of years.
And is it the two of
The
you,
two of
or-
us, yeah.
yeah.
We basically use the Peter and Diane, the Diane
Right.
Abbott book, and
Right,
just go
right.
through that.
Yeah.
And it's been I think almost 2 years now, so it's overdue.
Yeah. I'm teaching a sort of similar
Uh-huh.
course, but it's for undergrads. But I find that it's that the Dan and Abbott
Yeah,
is too
it's not
hard.
it's not ideal.
basically.
Yeah, I mean, especially for undergraduates, I think it's way above there. I mean, I think there's other books now out there that are probably more ideal. I mean, have you found one?
I haven't,
Okay.
although I saw that Paul Miller has something. I haven't looked
Okay.
at it.
Yeah.
And you have something, but I haven't looked at it.
I mean, we don't have. I don't have anything.
Sam says still at the hospital. Please convey my apologies.
Oh, no,
Yeah.
okay.
Okay. So,
I tell me my regards also.
Okay.
Hopefully things will work out.
yeah. So we have changed all of Harvard scheduling or the FAS scheduling has changed.
Yeah.
It used to be that when we said noon, it really meant 12:07, and that allowed people time to get there or
Yes.
do whatever.
Yes.
And now they have this strict. They're trying to institute this strict idea that we start on time.
I see. Oh, okay.
And then you should probably. So I'll set my intro
Yeah,
will be
yeah.
30 seconds or
Right,
something like
right.
that. But
Yeah.
you should probably aim
Yeah.
to have certainly finish the whole formal
Yeah.
presentation by 1 o'clock.
Yeah, I'm hoping for less than that, but yeah, we'll
Yeah.
see
All right.
depending on the
That's
questions that
fine.
I
Yeah,
have. I don't have that many slides.
Okay.
So, yeah.
And
Yeah.
anyway, it's sort of for a funny reason. They're opening this Alston campus where chunks of engineering are actually going to move over there.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Like CS actually is moving
really?
over there in a couple of years.
Right,
But
right.
to prime us, they're trying to get us ready. They've
Yes.
got this new universal schedule, and it's
Okay.
supposed to allow 15 minutes to get across the river.
I see. I see.
Stuff like that.
Yeah, because students have to make their way to their class.
Yeah,
and
that's
all
right.
that.
Yeah, I don't know if it's really going to work. So I'm going to start.
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah.
Okay. All right. All right. I'm going to get started. So it's my pleasure to introduce Raj Rao for the CBS seminar today. You want me to talk? And he was an undergrad at Angelo State University, which is in the geometrical center of Texas. I had to look it up, but that's where it is. And he was summa cum laude in both computer science and math, and went from there to University of Rochester and did his PhD work with Dana Ballard there, a famous computer vision computer scientist there. And from that graduate work came famous results on predictive coding. That's just originally how I knew about Raj is Rao and Ballard. It's just Rao and Ballard is predictive coding. The idea there, I'm sure it's going to be part of his talk today, but the idea is that the brain is a predictive machine. And what it does is it builds internal hierarchical models of sensory inputs, and the neurons inside of this brain compare the sensory data coming in and generated model data from a layer above, and computes the errors on that. And the whole thing is sort of internally self-consistent. It's beautiful work, beautiful result. He went from Rochester to do a postdoc with Terry Sinofsky at the Salk Institute. Actually, he was part of what was the predecessor of the Swartz Centers. So before Swartz, there was the Sloan Centers. And in the first 7 years of that enterprise, the Sloan Foundation supported these postdoc fellows. And he did elaborations and applications of predictive coding. And since then, he's been at the University of Washington in the Department of Computer Science, and I think with a bunch of other affiliations. And he's done all kinds of interesting work, and also is well known for his Coursera course with Adrian Fairhall, who was here last week on computational neuroscience. So today he's going to tell us about the Bayesian brain, and I'm really looking forward to it. So thanks, Rob.
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you all for coming. What I'll do today is just give you, first of all, a brief overview of the predictive coding work that I began as a graduate student, sort of giving you the context for where that came about, but then transitioning into some of the more recent modeling work we've done, all culminating in this sort of idea of the brain as a Bayesian inference engine, which actually goes back to Helmholtz, who also looked at perception and the brain as an inference engine. Just to set the context, you always have to pay tribute to your origin. So this is basically Dana Ballard, my thesis advisor. Now he's at the University of Texas Austin. And on the right-hand side is, in this day of deep learning, you probably know about convolution and so on. But when I was doing my graduate studies, we had something called a DataCube MV200, which was this huge, powerful machine that could do convolutions, right? That was used by the military for tracking missiles and so on. This was basically what we were using, and we were doing what was called active vision, right? So we were trying to have camera systems that had motors on them that could move just like the human eyes do, and trying to do things like recognition and detection of objects and so on, using saliency maps and so on and so forth. And as we were doing that, one of the big questions that we were always trying to understand was, how is the brain actually solving this problem, right? There's some clues from the anatomy. There's sort of this dichotomy between dorsal and ventral streams, the what versus where kind of architecture. So we were trying to emulate that, but we really didn't have much deep insight into how the brain might actually be trying to solve some of these computational problems. I did my postdoc, as was mentioned, at the Salk Institute, and so at that time, Francis Crick used to also come for tea, and Terry Slab, and so it was actually a great way to interact with one of the greatest minds of the 21st century, and also try to brainstorm about ideas about the brain and so on. And so one of the bigger questions that we would always talk about was the cortex, and what exactly is the underlying principle governing the cortical function, right? And so this sort of intersected with some of the work that I had done with Dana Ballard in terms of active vision and so on. So that's the genesis of a lot of the ideas that you'll find in the predictive coding papers. So here's the bigger question, right? Which is motivates a lot of us in this room, and also motivated us back in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And so the idea is there's some regularity and some structure in the cortex, in the cerebral cortex, or you can also call it the neocortex. And for example, there's this 6-layered structure, and there's certain layers that appear to be receiving inputs from so-called lower areas of the cortex. And there's definitely diverse, and it's diverse in terms of the function. So different locations on the cortex seem to be encoding for different types of modalities and so on. But in terms of the actual sort of anatomy, if you look at a piece of cortex from somatosensory cortex and look at a piece of cortex from auditory cortex, it would be very hard to distinguish in terms of the actual structure itself, right? If you give it to a physiologist, maybe you could tell which cortex it is based on how many sort of layers within the middle layers do you have and so on. But ultimately, there seems to be at least some uniformity in structure. So a lot of people sort of speculating about, is there a common principle underlying the computational functioning of the cerebral cortex? And this goes back to Creutzfeldt and Barlow and Francis Crick himself and so on, suggesting that maybe there's something there that we should be looking for, because there seems to be some uniformity in terms of the kinds of computational principles that might be at work in different areas of the cortex. There's also some interesting clues that one could try to glean from the anatomy of the cortex itself. So on the right-hand side is a classic picture in terms of trying to come at the hierarchical structure, right, of the visual parts of the cortex. And also here you'll see this kind of what versus where kind of split that people are trying to impose. Obviously they're not separate, completely separate streams. There's interactions going on between the dorsal and ventral streams, but roughly speaking, there seems to be a factoring of visual information into the features and the object-specific representations on one side, and on the other side, more representations geared towards analyzing spatial transformations and motion and so on and so forth. And so that's another clue that one could potentially take. And there seems to also be this hierarchical abstraction of representations, starting from the lowest levels where you appear to be coding for things that look like edges and so on, all the way up to the higher level representations, which seem to be coding for more complex kinds of objects. So another piece of other clues that you get are obviously from the neurophysiology. So this is the classic, Hubel and Wiesel experiment that you can download or you can look at YouTube. And since I'm at Harvard, I have to play this, pay tribute to David Hubel, who was here. And so as you can see here, in this classic experiment, they showed that there are cells in the primary visual cortex that respond to oriented bars that are very localized in space, and also the orientation is very important. And also they found that there is selectivity to particular directions. For example, some cells might encode only particular directions of motion. One puzzling result that they found back in their paper in the late 60s and early 70s was something called end stopping, right? Which is that a cell that is responding robustly to a bar that is within its receptive field at an appropriate orientation, so this is shown by the cartoon over here, appears to be shut off, right? It gets suppressed by the same bar when it's extended beyond its so-called classical receptive field, right? And so the phenomenological sort of explanation may be that maybe there's these are cells that encode the ends of these bars. So that's why they're called end stops. So they're stopped by any kind of extension of the bars. But the question is, why is that really happening in terms of a normative point of view, right? Does that really serve some computational function? Does it reflect something about how the world is structured, that the brain is actually utilizing this particular mechanism for coding these kinds of longer edges, for example? And interesting, there's some insights you get if you go down a couple of levels below the cortex. So if you go down to the level of retina, people had already observed that there are these kinds of suppression that goes on in the retinal ganglion cells. So for example, if you look at the classical receptive field, let's say of the retinal ganglion cell, typically they respond to spots of light, as you know from your introduction to neurobiology courses. But then if you extend the spot of light beyond its classical receptive field to make it a bigger spot of light, as shown on the right-hand side, again, you get a suppression, right? You get a reduction in the responses when you flash that bigger spot of light. And so back in 1982, Srinivasan et al. Had a very nice paper relating that particular phenomenon to predictive coding, right? So what they said was, in terms of information theory and efficiency and so on, it makes sense to actually explain this particular phenomenon as the retinal ganglion cells is computing a difference between a prediction of what to expect that you calculate based on the surrounding information. In this case, the surrounding, the disk that's surrounding the center. And then you do a weighted sum of the pixels, right, of all the surrounding pixel values, and try to make a prediction for what is in the center of this particular receptive field, right? So essentially, you're trying to say, okay, I'm going to look at only the differences between what's in the center and what can be predicted from the surrounding pixel values, and then that is the signal that is conveyed through the optic nerve to the next processing stage, which would be the lateral geniculate nucleus in the thalamus, right? So one question you can ask is, why is that a good efficient coding strategy, right? Any suggestions? Why do you think that it's good to convey these errors as opposed to the actual raw pixel values? Trying to make it interactive here. There won't be any quiz at the end, though. So energy, yeah. So there's a couple of reasons. So it could be that if you're always sending these error signals, if the error signals are actually typically small compared to the raw pixel values, then you don't have to really be firing as much, right? The other reason is the dynamic range of neurons is limited. So if you really don't want to be sending a huge range of pixel values, you can actually maximize that usage of the limited dynamic range of neurons if you're only sending these error signals, right? These small deviations from zero. So hopefully most of the time it's zero, right? But when do you think this actually works? So what if you live in a world where we don't have the kind of natural image statistics and the physical structure that we have right now, right? So this only works in what kind of world? The one we live in? Okay. Yeah, so basically it only works when there's extended structures. For example, there's statistics that extend beyond just a little point in space. there's actually uniformity or regularity, that the surrounding regions have similar statistics as the central region. So there's some extension because of objects that are there in the world. We don't live in a world where there's random pixelated things around the world, right? There's actually some extension of the statistics in the neighboring areas, and that's really what makes this work. Is you're actually making use of the redundancy in the natural world, and so the redundancy allows you to encode these errors in prediction. Okay. So if you go up to the level of the visual cortex, people have already observed that you get these kinds of suppression. But interestingly, the suppression is not simple, right? It's not just a blob of light surrounded by another blob of light. It has to be a little bit more sophisticated in this case. So it happens to be in this case, it's the orientation space, right? So if the statistics of what's in the center in terms of orientation statistics matches what's in the surrounding region, then you start to see the same kind of phenomenon that you saw in the retina, which is a suppression, right? So on the left-hand side is some result from Zipser showing that if there's this random texture, that the central texture is of a different orientation from the surrounding texture, you see a greater firing rate from the visual cortical neuron compared to when the central texture matches the surrounding texture. So it's the same principle that there's some redundancy that the visual system is trying to encode. And so it's trying to make use of the fact that the orientation statistics tend to match in any local region of the image. On the right-hand side is an orientation contrast experiment, also a classical experiment showing that as you increase the contrast between the center and the surrounding region, in terms of the orientations becoming more and more orthogonal to each other, you also have an increase in the firing rate. So again, that can be interpreted as the error signal becoming bigger in the case of the center and the surround not matching, but now in the orientation statistics space. I think that's a question of the way back, yeah. So, yeah, so this is not the only phenomenon. So the question was, how do you explain some cases where you might actually see an enhancement of responses, right? You might see that there's enhancement of responses. So this particular explanation only works for neurons that encode error signals. So we're basically interpreting one class of responses that encode error signals, but the model, as you'll see later, also has other components you need to have in order to be able to compute the predictions, right? So it's possible that there's other phenomenology that cannot be explained by just treating everything as an error signal. So that's not really what the model is about. All right, so the question is why, right? Why is this particular behavior really, prominent in the visual cortex in many different guises, right? So, and I think that's one of the more important questions to ask for us as neuroscientists, as computational neuroscientists, is, we can always describe phenomena. You can have descriptive models, which are great. We can have mathematical equations, differential equations that describe the phenomena that we see. But I think the bigger question also from, if you really want to understand how the brain has evolved to do what it does, is why, right? So why is it that this is the way that the brain has chosen to encode, scenes, right, natural scenes? And so I think as I mentioned, a lot of the insights could come from considering why the brain has evolved to process information, and that could be, in this case, through looking at natural image statistics, right? So if you look at natural image statistics, you tend to see that there's a high probability that there's some consistency or extension in terms of orientation statistics across extended regions in space. And so this seems to be a sensible strategy to use, which is to, if you want to minimize redundancy in terms of what you're sending to the next stage in your processing, you would like to get rid of redundancy by trying to predict away things that are explainable at every level, and then only send the unexplained parts to the next level in your processing. All right, so this is basically a cartoon depiction of this prediction error correction kind of model, the predictive coding model. So typically what you have here is some loop, so I can use the pointer here. Oh, no, maybe not. Let's try that again. Okay, so we'll use this pointer. So what you can see here, right, is the feedback part, and that part is postulated to compute some predictions, which are then compared to the inputs that are coming in, and then the error signal is then filtered through some particular precision weighting or gain matrix, and then there's a feed-forward pathway that then goes through some feed-forward matrix synapses and so on. And this part over here, you can think of it as lateral connections or recurrent connections within a particular location, within a particular area. And that particular part I'll talk about later, that has to do with the dynamics of the scene or the images, right? So For now, let's ignore that part. Those are the recurrent synapses. But typically, so think of basically having a feed-forward pathway and a recurrent pathway, and then that's the whole idea behind predictive coding is you need to be able to compute some predictions, and that's given by this transformation from one representation here, the more abstract representation down to the lower level representation, and then going the other way is computing the error signal and then updating that representation, going back again, and so on. So ultimately, what you have here is a feedback loop that says, here's what I expect, and then you have the error that is used to correct the estimate that you might have right now, and then that again is used to make another prediction, and so on, right? And for a static image, you might keep doing that until you converge to some stable representation, but more typically, the brain is in a dynamic mode, so it's always trying to make some adjustments and adjust its predictions and so on. And so I'd like to make this transition now from there to how it relates to the whole concept of Bayes' theorem and Bayesian inference, because they're very closely related, and you can look at predictive coding as just one particular implementation of the broader class of Bayesian inference models that people are trying to use to try to understand the brain. So you can look at predictive coding as an implementation of Bayesian inference, and on the bottom right side you can see a very simple depiction of what really Bayes' theorem or Bayesian inference in general lets you do, both as a agent, like a robot in a world, or if you're an animal trying to perform behavior, right, in a natural world. It basically lets you, it's a mathematical calculus that lets you essentially take new information and then update your belief about the world based on when you might have some prior beliefs about the world, and then come up with a revised belief or revise your belief of the world based on new evidence that's coming in. That's basically all it is, right? It's basically a mechanism for always being able to revise your belief about what's coming in. So who's Bayes, right? So Bayes was actually a Presbyterian minister, right? So, and he was Reverend Thomas Bayes. And his first publication was actually this, right? So you won't find this, referred to too much in Google Scholar, fortunately. And it was called Divine Benevolence, right? So anybody know what that was about? Anybody read this paper? So in fact, it was actually a pretty valiant effort to counter another paper somebody had published doubting the sincerity of God to be benevolent. So saying that there's some doubt about that. So this is actually his proof that God is actually kind and benevolent to human beings, right? So basically, it's an attempt to prove that the principal end of the divine providence and government, which I guess is his name for God, is the happiness of his creatures, right? So not just humans, but all creatures, right? The happiness of creatures. But unfortunately, it was not very well cited, so we won't be talking much about that paper. The one that it really, sort of revolutionized, after he had died, his friend Richard Price actually published this paper. This was published posthumously, and this actually has the very first instance of what later came to be called Bayes' theorem, right? So. And I'd also like to kind of make a note here that I'm making this picture a little bit hazy because we actually do not know if that's really a picture of Bayes. For all we know, it could be some 18th century reverend, right? So there's some debates among mathematicians that maybe that's not really a picture of Bayes. So let's sort of keep him a little uncertain there, right? So it's uncertainty even in terms of his picture. So here's the really simplistic kind of notion of what Bayes' theorem really does. So it takes some prior belief or some quantity you don't know about. Think of X as some state or hidden state of the world that you don't know about, and then you have some new information that's coming in that you'd like to incorporate, and so Bayes' theorem lets you do that, and then you have a revised belief, right? And on the right-hand side is the standard definition of Bayes' theorem, right? And it just falls out of the definition of how conditional probability relates to joint probability, right? From the definition of that. But the nice thing here is that it tells you how you start off with some prior belief, which was this P of X, and then when you have a new information coming in, you take that information, multiply it, normalize it, and you get the new belief. So X given I is your new belief of how the world has changed according to your own model and so on, compared to what you had before, which is just the prior probability of the X. So here's let's do a little simple. I don't even want to call it a psychophysics experiment, but here's. We can try to see how this really works in terms of perception, right, over time. So who do you think this is? Can you tell just from the shoulder of this person who that is? You're pretty surprised if you can, unless you've seen the picture before in the talk. David Hubel, oh, that's a good guess. That's actually using your prior pretty heavily there, right? So we are, I mean, you can use our priors, at this point, that's pretty much all you have, right? Because it's hard to use this evidence. This image is just a shoulder, right? It could be anybody's shoulder. If I give you a little bit more information, how about the hair?
Abraham Lincoln.
Whoa, okay, so somebody's got a pretty strong likelihood function. So how many of you agree it's Abraham Lincoln? Yeah? Some more? How about if I give you the eyes? That sort of is almost a dead giveaway, right? If it's the eyes. So yeah, it is actually Abraham Lincoln, right? And as I give you more information, you can see, you're forming better and better, like a stronger and stronger belief of who that person is, right? There's also, a ton of other, more rigorous ways of showing that the brain potentially could be using, Bayesian inference. So these are all lots of papers. It's actually now quite outdated, but there's a lot more papers that have come out. One interesting demonstration I like to show is the very first one. This is the motion from cast shadows from Curson et al. And so here's the the particular depiction of their stimulus. You might have seen this before. So what I'm going to show you is this ball over here is going to move exactly in the same trajectory 2 times, but then the perception that the brain creates is going to be dramatically different because the shadow is going to be changed in the 2 different iterations, right? So here it is, 1, 2. Right, so the only thing changing here is the shadow, right? So it basically shows that, what they did in this case, in their model, they show that if you assume a prior, a probability distribution in terms of how the illumination is assumed to be by the brain, which is, in this case, they show that the best assumption here is that the illumination is stationary and also it's overhead. Those are sort of ecologically quite valid assumptions you can make, right? Because we live in a world where, our favorite star tends to have those properties of being overhead and stationary. Then you can actually explain these kinds of illusions of how we create, motion from cast shadows. So there's a couple of books that I was involved in co-editing. The right-hand one was actually a NIPS workshop before NIPS was so hot that it got sold out faster than a Taylor Swift concert. Sort of heard happened this year. And you can't really register now, right? You can't really go there even if you wanted to. So back in those good old days, when we had workshops that were a lot more sort of neuroscience, computational neuroscience oriented. And so that was one of the first workshops that we tried to organize to try to get at some of these models. And then more recently, there's another book that was co-edited called Bayesian Brain. And so we started to look at some of these kinds of models of how we can explain behavior mostly using Bayesian models. So here's one of the sort of pictures you can have in mind when you start thinking about the Bayesian brain is, the fundamental idea is that there's some inputs that organisms are receiving, and there's some hidden states of the world that they don't have access to. So we don't have access to actual states of the world. All we have access to are, the measurements. So we always have measurements that we're making using our sense organs. And those sensor measurements are all we have, but the whole problem there is to invert that transformation from our sensors to the hidden state of the world, right? And so the goal is to estimate the probability of the causes of our sensory information that's coming in, and then ultimately, of course, take quote unquote so optimal actions, right? So actions that will get us to some particular goal that we might have, which could be, for example, maximizing some expected reward, but also minimizing the metabolic costs and things like that. So there's the ultimate goal is that, but you're combining the two, right? So you're actually doing both inference, but also doing action selection, and then you're trying to combine the two into some coherent framework. And so that's a picture what one could have in mind as we're trying to build some of these models. So the simplest kind of model that many of you are probably already quite familiar with is a linear generative model. So a linear model is basically something that takes some, in this case, some set of basis filters, let's say, and then tries to reconstruct an image, right? So if you want a linear generative model of images, then you could say, okay, let's try to do that using some set of basis functions or basis filters. In this case, if you take this image of Einstein and focus on a particular feature like the eye, you could say, okay, can I construct or reconstruct or predict that particular part of the image by linearly combining with different weights some set of filters, right, or some set of oriented edges, So you can see that in this case, you take these edges, and then there's some particular response you might get. So this is basically, if you do a dot product, like a convolution across the entire image, and look at that location, you might get those kinds of values. So that basically says how closely similar, like how similar are these edges to what is there in that part of the image, right? So just do a dot product and take the value out. And that's given by that vector on the right-hand side. Let's call that a response vector, or R, right, that vector R. So this is basically going forward, right? This is the analysis part. You're analyzing an image by breaking it down into its components or parts, right? In this case, these 4 plus 3 plus 2 filters, right? And then what you can do is you can do a synthesis part, which is you can take that particular set or any particular set of numbers, which are this vector R, and you can linearly combine them, as shown at the bottom, and you can generate some other image, right? And hopefully, if you have a good model and you have a good set of responses, then it'll be a nice looking image that looks pretty close to the original image that came in, right? So that's you can look at that part as the prediction part, right? So you can basically combine the two, right? You can say, okay, you have an analysis, then you have a synthesis, right? And this kind of sort of motivates the predictive coding model, right? So you can see that there's this combination of analysis and synthesis, right? And then, of course, you might ask the question, how do we actually compute that response vector and this particular best set of responses, right? You want to compute that. And also, on the longer term, you want to learn these filters or these representations, right? And that's where you can talk about how do you optimize that particular those two functions, right? So, and that's where the error comes in, right? So you can start to compare the original input and your attempt to predict it, and you can look at the error signal and then try to minimize that error function, right? But everybody comfortable with that? This linear generative model idea. So basically, it's linearly combining some particular set of basis filters to generate an image, right? And that's what it means to have a linear generative model. So here's a little bit more probabilistic way of doing it, which is making it a little bit more rigorous, which is you can say, okay, you have any particular image I at time t. You're going to linearly combine it with some set of basis, filters or functions. So U is basically a matrix whose columns are each of those filters you saw in the previous slide. So each of those columns is one particular filter. And then R is that response vector. So when you multiply a matrix with a vector, you're going to get a linear combination of all those columns, right? And then out comes some particular prediction of an image. And then the N over there is just a error vector, right? So it's basically the error between the input and what was predicted. So you can look at that as some kind of a noise vector, right? So if your predictions are good, then hopefully it becomes a zero mean, white noise term, right? So that's the assumption you're making in this case. You're saying that my linear predictions are good enough that any deviations from the image that I'm trying to predict are going to be modeled as a zero mean and also a Gaussian white noise, right? So there's no correlation from one time step to the other in terms of those errors that you're getting between the input and your predictions, okay? So that's basically the spatial generative model. And one last thing is you can say, okay, the world is not static. There's always going to be some dynamics there. So you can also add a dynamics to this model, which says that the hidden state, this vector R, also changes over time. So how do you actually model that? So again, you can use a linear model for that also, right? So you're saying my current representation is some matrix V times the previous response I had, and then add some Gaussian noise to it also, right? So it turns out that these two are very standard models in engineering. So if you look at things like, you might have heard of Kalman filters or Kalman filtering, they exactly use this particular model, right? You can also look at this as a hidden Markov model in a continuous sense of the world. So there's some hidden state, and it's Markov in the sense that the next state depends only on the previous state. So you can look at this as a hidden Markov model, right? So there's a lot of relationships with classical, statistics and classical engineering techniques. And then finally, the goal is to find, some particular, at each time steps, you're trying to find that optimal representation of the world, right? The R vector is what you have of your representation based on your basis filters and so on. What you think is happening out there in the world, that's this R vector. And you're doing that given all the inputs or observations or sensory measurements you made so far, right? Right from time step 1 all the way till the current time step. So I'll spare you all the math. You can always look that up. But basically, when you start to optimize it by minimizing the error between the input that came in and your prediction based on this linear combination of basis filters, then you get an equation that looks like that. And that's basically you can look at that as a simplified form of a Kalman filter, or you can look at that as, you have a prediction error function, you're doing gradient descent on it, and you get that as part of that gradient descent solution. But it basically has two components. So it's saying my representation at this point in time, t, that this r of hat, so a little hat on top of it, is equal to some r bar, which is the prediction I'm making based on my previous time step, plus some error signal I'm using to correct my prediction. Okay, so the first part on the left-hand side is the prediction of what I expect to see. The second part is the error signal, the error between my prediction and what actually came in. And combining the two is going to correct my estimate for this time step. And I'm going to use that in the next time step to make my next prediction, right? And keep doing that over and over again, right? So there's always going to be a prediction step and then a correction step, okay? And some interesting components there. So this U transpose is basically, remember, that was the feed-forward filters. Those were all the ones where you're multiplying it with the image and you're getting some response. So you're using that to filter the error signal. And the second interesting term is this G function. So that turns out to be a way to decide how much to weight the errors that are coming in. So you can look at that as, in the Kalman filter, it turns out to be the inverse of the variance. So it's like a precision term. So the more variance there is in the inputs, the less attention you give it or less weight you give it. So it has a very nice correlation with, in terms of the noise that's there in the input channel versus the noise in your own predictions. So if your input gets very noisy, if input channels get very noisy, then the gain matrix there is decreased. So you don't pay as much attention to the inputs that are coming in. The errors don't have as much influence, and you believe your prediction even more. Whereas if you have not much knowledge in your, not much confidence in your predictions, then you pay a lot more attention to the input. So then the gain function can go up. So you can basically use it to essentially model attention, for example, right? So you can think of it as an attentional matrix, okay, that gates the inputs that are coming in. So it's going back to that picture again. Here's the picture to have in mind, which is you have some input coming in, you subtract it, get the error. You have the gain matrix that decides how much the inputs have to be weighed in terms of the input error. And then you go, and then there's the recurrent synapses, which are doing the prediction, right? That was that Markov model that is making a prediction for the next time step. And then that is used again to translate back to the lower level, and then so on and so forth, right? So you keep doing that over and over again. You can extend this to multiple stages. So in those days we called it hierarchical predictive coding. I guess in these days we would have called it deep predictive coding. I guess that's the buzzword now, right? But basically it's adding multiple layers. So you can essentially replicate this. You can do pooling, so you can actually take little patches and then you can start to combine them and make bigger receptive fields at the next level and so on. As you build up this network, you can have multiple layers, and each layer is trying to predict what's happening at the lower level and so on and so forth. And one last thing that also makes this an interesting kind of prediction is to look at what do you mean by different layers, right? So each of these layers, anatomically, they project to different locations. So for example, the superficial layers in the cortex tend to project to the hierarchically the next area, the more abstract area in the cortex. So V1 to V2, you tend to see the inputs to V2 coming in from layers 2 and 3. And then similarly, if you look at layer 6 in V1, you might see the outputs going down to the LGN or the thalamus. And then similarly, layer 5, right, sends its outputs to some subcortical areas, right? So some people look at that as the output layer of the cortex. And so you can start to relate some of these ideas to the equations that we saw before, right? And you could say, okay, the error signal, if it really is an error signal, is going to be most prominent in the superficial layers, in layers 2 and 3. The inputs, from the preceding layer, the input errors, right, are probably coming in the input layer, which would be in layer 4, right, the middle layers. And then finally, if you think about the state estimate, this R vector that you're computing using using the information from the error and your prediction, that would be the output, right, that you'd be sending to subcortical areas. So that would have to be in layer 5, for example. And then layer 6 would be the information going back to the lower level, right, your prediction of what you expect to see. So you can have this kind of a mapping. So it gives you some ways to test some of these components, all right, of the model if you're able to go down the different layers of the cortex. So in that paper, we did a few comparisons. So for example, looking at end stopping, so it does give you those kinds of behaviors. If you train up this network, a 2-level network on natural images from Ansel Adams in this case, you start to see these kinds of responses that look similar to cortical end stopping and so on. And then finally, there's also some interesting results from other labs. This was Scott Murray and others showing that if you look at human fMRI and you show humans these 3 different kinds of stimuli, where the first one is a jumble of edges with no coherent structure. The second is using the same edges create a 2-dimensional shape. And finally, using the same edges, you create now a 3-dimensional edge. What you see is that the lower areas light up, or they get more activated for the first kind of random lines. But then as you increase the coherence, make it more complicated of an object, or an object that looks more like a 3D object, you start to see higher activations in the higher areas, right? So for example, here the 3D in a higher area is much more strongly eliciting a response compared to when you give it this random set of lines. Then you don't have as much of a response for the higher area, but you have a bigger response for the lower areas, right? So it sort of fits in with this idea that each area is trying to account for, explain statistics at its own level of representation. But then as you go to the higher levels, the lower levels get suppressed if the higher levels are able to explain away what's happening at that level of abstraction. And then this was something that's interesting. I mean, this is about a couple of years ago, I happened to look at this particular Google Scholar citation, because that became available, right? And then if you look at what's really happened over the last, starting from 1999, almost 10 years, there's not much interest, right? There's a few citations here and there, and then something happened around 2011, 2012, right, where suddenly there's a lot of interest in this. I'm not personally I don't quite understand what really happened. It might just be that the tools are now available that you can start to tease apart this kind of a framework. Or maybe it's just that a lot of people are publishing papers falsifying the model, right? That could be there too. So I don't know which part of it is true. Maybe it's both, right? But one interesting paper that came out just this summer in July was this paper trying to figure out the functional organization of cortical feedback connections. And in this paper, they showed that there seems to be some kind of the feedback that comes in from a higher area to a lower area seems to be orthogonal in terms of the preferences of where they're targeting in the lower area, right? So the orientation, for example, could be orthogonal to the orientation preference of the higher level area. So it seemed like maybe that isn't as consistent with what you would expect with a predictive coding type model. But interestingly, if you look at what that could potentially be doing, right? So this was actually a Newson views in the same issue by Carl Friston. He basically pointed out that if you look at this sensory error gain, this gain that says, okay, which part of the error signal are you going to be, weighting high or low, right? That exactly would be suppressing, for example, orthogonal orientations if it turns out that that's the part where you want to give lower weight, right, lower evidence for that particular part of the input signal. So this was actually just quoted from his paper saying that you'd be expecting in the superficial pyramidal cells, superficial layers, those are the ones which would be reporting these prediction errors. You expect to see this kind of a precision weighting of the opposite preferences, right? So that's actually interesting. So I think the debate still goes on, right, in terms of how can we actually tease apart and try to falsify this model or try to show that there's some evidence in support of it or not. In the last part of the talk, I'd like to sort of transition into this newer way of looking at how do you actually bring in the kinds of inferences that might be going in the cortex, bring that into a bigger picture of the brain, which is actually trying to perform actions, and relate that to some of the decision making and reinforcement learning type literature. Okay. And so for the starting point for this is, again, if you think of the cortex, right, and predictive coding is just one model of what the cortex might be doing. There's other models that people have suggested for probabilistic population coding and the sampling-based models for encoding posterior distribution. So they're all Bayesian models of how the cortex might be computing Bayesian estimates of input coming in. But if you look at the way that the information is being used, right, one prominent set of connections that goes down subcortically is to the striatum in the basal ganglia. There's a huge funnel of information from the cortex going into the striatum, and then that information gets processed by the basal ganglia, and then it gets sent back to the cortex, mostly in a prefrontal cortex. And that particular loop has been implicated in action selection, skill learning, and motor skill learning, and action selection, and so on, right? And so we were trying to see if we can start to get to that particular anatomical functionality, right? And so the way that we try to model that was by using something called partially observable Markov decision processes. It's a mouthful, but it can be cool and say POMDP, right? So this is a technique that's been in use in robotics and AI for some time now. And it basically assumes that the world has some dynamics. It's very similar to the Kalman filter type model. There's some transition of states from state S to S, S prime, or T plus 1 to T, or sorry, T to T plus 1, and so on. But there's also an action involved. So you basically say, I'm in this state, I take a particular action, I'm going to get to the next state, right? And so it's again a Markov model, but it's an action conditional model, right? You're conditioning your next state on the actions you're taking at this point in time. So that's given by some probability distribution that's shown over there. And then when you, if you have a person or an agent, an animal interacting with the world, it gets to only see observations through its sensors. So you get an observation, I'm calling it O prime over here, and that's conditioned on whatever state the world is in, right? So whatever the state is, you get an observation, and that's according to some probability distribution, P of O prime given S. And you might also get a reward, right? Or some reward or penalty, right? So that's given by that R function there, okay? And then the goal of the agent is to choose the action to perform next based on the information it's gotten so far, right? So that's the action A, right? So people familiar with, for example, reinforcement learning, right? So if you've taken courses in reinforcement learning and Q learning and so on, right? It's very similar to that. The only difference, right? Do you see the difference? What's the difference between this and the reinforcement learning model? No value. Well, we can have a value, but what about this part here, right? The observation, right? So in a reinforcement learning model, you assume that the state of the world is known. So the whole state is actually observable. And this is a partially observable model, which means that you only get access to some observation O prime, which is related to the state of the world through this model here, right? And so actually, that's exactly what we did. Remember, with the linear generative model was also one of these kinds of models that said, the state of the world R is related to the state of the to the observation image I, right, through some linear transformation. So that's exactly what this is, except this is a more general way of representing that, right? So state to observation is given by some probability distribution, okay? So it's a more general, a more difficult actually problem than a traditional reinforcement learning problem. And so the way that you can make decisions optimally using this framework is, through two different components. One is the Bayesian inference component, where the animal is computing beliefs about the world, because the actual state is not known. It's computing some beliefs about what it's encountering. And then the other important aspect is your actions are actually based on the belief, right? So actually based on theoretically the entire probability distribution over all the possible states, right? So, and that's really important, because now you can make actions based on the uncertainty that you're experiencing. So if you're not sure about the world, you might want to wait a little bit, gather some more evidence before you commit to a particular action, right? So you have those kinds of options where your decision making depends on the uncertainty that you are experiencing at any point in time, right? So there's both a policy network and a value network, and they're being used to actually compute. The policy computes the actions based on the value of all the states you're expecting to encounter next, right? So that's basically the policy maximizes an expected future reward function. That's exactly like in a reinforcement learning setting. You're basically trying to maximize this expected reward that you expect to get based on the actions you commit to right now. Okay, so that's the general framework. Okay, so it still has the Bayesian inference component. So this part could be, you pick your favorite model for Bayesian inference in the brain, and that could be that part. But then you also have this policy computing and value computing also going on. And there's a way to relate that to the striatum and the globus pallidus and so on that basically mimic some of these components of the model. I'm not going to go through that in detail. There's several papers that we've published on this particular model. But essentially, it allows you to relate some of these components of the model to some of the aspects of the basal ganglia. For example, there's something called a temporal difference error, which is basically a reward prediction error. And that can be related to the dopamine responses you get from this structure called the substantia nigra, pars compacta. So you can actually start to relate some of the predictions of the model to those kinds of dopamine responses. I'll leave you with a couple of examples of how we've used this. So this is a very classic task, going back to Newsom and Shadlin, and this is actually from Mike Shadlin. So this is actually a monkey that's solving the random dot task. So you can see that there's an eye movement made to a particular location because the monkey thought that the dots were moving in that particular direction. And they're also recording from the lateral intraparietal area, so you get that spike train that's shown at the bottom, right? And this is for one particular direction of motion. And then if you have an opposite direction, so in this case, it was in the opposite direction, so you can see that the spikes are not as much, right? There's a reduction in the firing rate, right? So basically, this particular task has both uncertainty, so you don't know the actual state of the world, because the state of the world in this case is what? It's the direction of motion, right? So the animal doesn't know the direction of motion. It has to infer that based on the random dots that it sees. Those are the observations. And so in this particular case, they're recording neurons that seem to be implicated in that particular function. And so on the left-hand side is, if you plot belief, right? In this case, belief that the motion is towards the rightward direction, and look at different amounts of noise in the stimulus. So 4%, 8% is the amount of coherence. So 4% means only 4% of the dots are moving coherently in a particular direction, and 40% is a very strong signal, right? So you can see that there's a much faster rise towards a probability of 1 or a probability of 0 for two different directions of motion, depending on what the coherence is, 4% to 40%. On the right-hand side are some of the cortical responses that seem to be behaving in somewhat similar ways, right? Where there's a ramp to a particular threshold that happens according to how strong the stimulus is. So this particular model actually predicts several different aspects of this task, and that have been corroborated by data that people have observed in humans and in monkeys. So for example, the model actually predicts you'll see a collapsing bound, right, or a collapsing threshold, right? So this actually shows, if you look at just the belief that the model is computing for the rightward direction of motion, you can see that the black line there is basically the trajectory, the belief going up and down, because there's, the coherence is very, very low. And then the top part and the bottom part are the two regions of this belief space, right, that are mapped to the two different actions. So choose right versus choose left. Okay, so that's the policy of this model, right? So the policy basically is a mapping from belief space, right, belief that the animal has, to the appropriate actions, right? And the red part is basically saying wait until you get more information. So the red part is basically a waiting zone, right? So the belief is in the middle part, then the uncertainty is very high, right? And so you don't want to commit to any action like choose the right eye movement or the left eye movement, okay? And what this shows is that over time, it makes sense for that region of waiting to collapse, which means that you wouldn't, even if you're given enough time, it doesn't make sense for you to be waiting and waiting and waiting to gather more information, right? Because if the coherence is very low, then no amount of information is going to give you enough information to make a right decision, right? So you might as well abandon this particular trial and make one of those two decisions and move on to the next trial, because there's always going to be a next trial where you're going to have potentially better, stronger values in your stimulus, right? Better coherence, right? And so these kinds of phenomena you can predict from the model itself. It's a purely normative prediction, right? So you're saying the goal is to maximize this reward function, then this is what you would expect to see, right? And so people have seen those kinds of phenomena. So there's something called an urgency signal, which turns out to be an implementation of this collapsing bound that people have seen. This is in Anne Churchland's lab, this particular figure from one of our papers. And so what this shows is that even for a 0% coherence, where there's no coherence at all, it's just random noise stimulus, there's still this increasing trajectory in the responses, right? So this basically is a reflection of the underlying collapsing bound that's being implemented in this particular, in these set of responses. We can also do things like change the prior probability of one direction of motion versus the other. So what if we make, for example, initially the prior probability was equal for the left and right directions of motion. But if you make it, let's say 0.2, right, for the rightward direction, 80% of the time you're going in the other direction, then what you see is a shift in this policy, prediction, right? And so it's not as simple as just changing the initial, starting point of this, this particular belief. So one would predict that you'd only have to change the initial belief to be 0.2 and 0.8, let's say in this case. Actually, what this model predicts is that it actually has a time varying effect on the way that the animal behaves. So there's a shift in the entire policy. And this is actually what they saw. So they actually saw, in this case, Hanks et al. Saw that there's a shift in terms of the actual dynamic responses themselves, right? It's not just the starting point that changes for the two conditions, which is what you would expect naively. You actually see the priors actually playing a role over time. So the more time elapses, the more you see the effect of the prior probability, which is another interesting prediction of this kind of a model. And finally, talking about dopamine, right? So if you think about what happens in terms of this reward prediction, so the model actually maintains an expectation of reward, and the expectation of reward is going to be contingent on how confident you are, right? What your belief is about the current stimulus. So if your stimulus is very strong, which means that you're pretty sure you're going to get the right answer, then you expect the reward with a very high probability. You're very confident that you're going to get the reward. If it's a very uncertain stimulus, then your confidence is low. Your belief about that stimulus might be low. So in that case, the expectation of reward is going to be also low, right? So you're not very likely to get the reward. So actually, this model lets you sort of titrate the prediction error, the belief that you have in terms of the prediction error also in the reward. So here's the predictions of the model. So you could say that in the easy case where there's, let's say 100% of the dots are moving the same direction, you're going to have, in the case of trials where you get the answer correct, right, which means that you got the right choice, then in the easy case, you have very small prediction error because most of the time, you get the right answer. Whereas in the hard case, right, your expectation, right, is actually low, right? So on average, you expect not to get the reward, right? So average expected reward is low. And when you actually do get the reward, you have a big difference, right, between the actual reward and your predicted reward, right? So you get a big prediction error, reward prediction error, which is plotted on the right-hand side there. Whereas if you are now looking at incorrect trials, right, error trials where you made a mistake, then you can see that you're very confident that you're going to get the reward and you didn't get the reward, which is a zero reward, right? Then you get a big difference. You get a big negative reward prediction error, right? Whereas in the case where you're sort of not expecting to get much of reward, so your average reward prediction is low, and then you did not get the reward eventually, right, because you made a mistake, then that error signal is going to be small, right, because the expected reward was also very low, and you got a zero, right? And so if you look at the data from Nomoto et al., they actually found exactly that kind of behavior, both for correct trials and for incorrect trials. They found this kind of an asymmetry between what the animal was expecting the reward to be and what the model actually predicts. All right, so finally, I won't go through details here, but two other ways in which we're using this POMDP framework to explain. One is to model a subject's confidence in their decision. So this is a pretty hot topic these days, but this model actually lends itself naturally to it because it has a notion of belief built into it. And so we're trying to work with Ruzbekhiani at NYU, looking at how we can start to model the confidence judgments. In this case, in the random dots task, he has data from experiments where the animal is given a sure target, where the animal can choose to go to the sure target if its confidence is low. So we have a window into what the confidence of the animal might be. And so we can actually predict when does the animal decide to go to the sure target as opposed to choosing the left and right targets, right? So based on the belief that the model is maintaining, it can decide to go towards the sure target and get a reward, which might not be a big reward, but a sure reward, compared to taking the risk and going towards the left or right choices and potentially not getting the reward, right? So you have to decide at what point do you commit to one of those two actions, or you decide to go with the sure target, right, and get a guaranteed but low reward. So we can make those kinds of predictions. And then finally, collaborating with Jean-Claude Dreher, we're actually able to now start to model some social decision making. So we're looking at some group decision making tasks. You might have heard of the volunteers dilemma task, right, where you have to essentially decide to forego some of your potential effort or money and so on, right, in the service of the bigger public good, right? And basically, if you repeat that process within a group many times, how do you figure out when to donate and when not to donate, right? So we have those kinds of data from humans playing each other, and we can use that we can use the POMDP model to model that also. It's a pretty flexible framework in that sense of the word. All right, so let me summarize. I think we're right on time. The Bayesian approach offers, what you can look at as normative models for a perception action, and then how to bring in rewards and start to look at decision making. And the predictive coding model is just one example of how you can start to implement neurally this Bayesian inference idea. And the POMDP model is a way to bring together models of Bayesian inference in the brain if you believe that the cortex has the capacity to perform Bayesian inference. How do you combine that with some of the other areas in the brain, like the basal ganglia, and bring in actions and rewards as part of that bigger picture? And then the neocortex, we propose that maybe you can look at that as a belief estimator. So it's actually maintaining beliefs about the world using an internal model that has learned and also been evolved over many generations. And it maintains a probabilistic internal model of the world. That's one view of it. And then the basal ganglia in that particular model of the POMDP is actually using that beliefs that are coming in from the cortex and computing actions and looking at the best actions. So using this notion of a policy, which maps beliefs to actions. And finally, I gave you examples of how you can start to explain, not just the anatomy and architecture, trying to find models that can acknowledge the anatomy and architecture, but also try to explain some of the physiological responses, like the surround suppression and stopping and things like that, and dopamine responses, and then start to also explain the behavior in these decision-making tasks. So I'll leave you with acknowledging my students and collaborators, and also the Hazy Bayes and Bellman for the reinforcement learning aspects. So thank you. Questions?
Questions for Raj?
All right, it was crystal clear. Yeah.
Maybe a general question about the grain at which you think the posterior distributions are represented in the brain. I mean, obviously, when you have two possible states in the world, it's pretty easy. But when you have a real-world situation, I mean, one way around it is sampling. Another way is that the brain really is just keeping track of maybe one belief variable and its confidence or something like that. What do you think the preponderance of the evidence in your modeling pushes you towards thinking?
Yeah, I think that's one of the most important questions in neuroscience today is, to what extent does the brain or the cortex really maintain, probability distributions, the kind of probability distribution that, if you believe in the POMDP model, you're supposed to be keeping track of the entire probability distribution across all the states that are relevant to your task. But that is computationally intractable, right? So you have to do some approximations. And at this point, I think it's still not clear, right? That does the brain actually just go with, one thing you could do is, like you mentioned, sampling. So you could be picking particular modes of that distribution and then trying that out and then moving on to another mode if it doesn't work out. So you could do those kinds of sampling-based approaches. And there is evidence, there's even people looking at probabilistic models that are based on sampling. But we know that, basically there's a lot of variability in neural responses. People call that noise, but it could also be used for these kinds of purposes. So I think it's an interesting potential avenue for research, right? So in the case of the predictive coding model, I mentioned the sort of split between the superficial layers and deep layers, and so the actual posterior computation would potentially be ascribed to the deeper layers. Like the layer 5 is where you potentially have the information. That's where I guess the vector R was supposed to be represented, right? The optimal estimate. But in theory, that's just a mean of a Gaussian distribution, right? So in that model, you're only computing the predictive coding model. At least the way that we presented it was only computing the mean of a distribution. But you could also be computing the covariance, right, or the variance or covariance. And that gives you some notion of uncertainty. And so the predictive coding model could have the uncertainty there as part of the entire loop. But you'd have to compute the variance or the covariance of the representation. Another way to look at it is you can also look at the predictive coding model as computing a mean, but then you could be doing sampling on top of that, right? And so then you could actually be combining multiple models together, predictive coding plus sampling, and then look at the probability distribution you get in that sense of the word. It's an approximation, right, to the true distribution. So we did some work. There's one paper we published on sampling-based probabilistic inference in Poisson neural networks. So that was trying to get at it using this notion. You might have heard of particle filtering, which is used in robotics. So particle filters are a way to generalize common filters to have nonlinearity in your generative model and also have non-Gaussian distributions. So you have multimodal distributions. So basically that corresponds to Monte Carlo sampling-based inference, right? So we try to relate that to the Poisson kind of distribution of spikes in neural networks and how you can start to map particle filtering type inference algorithms to a neural implementation, right? And people have suggested that before also. So I think there are multiple ways to go about it, but I think we need some sort of killer experiments to really nail down and falsify some of these hypotheses about how our posteriors maintain, if they are really true posteriors, are they distributions or are they just mean or the mode of the distribution? Yeah. Yeah.
Basically where you have the less sensory information. So that would be also where the prediction error will have a strong influence.
Yeah, so I mean the collapsing bound was more on the prediction of the POMDP model, and that comes about because of the reward prediction. That it's sort of the second part of the talk is where I talked about that, and it comes about because you're trying to maximize your expected reward into the future. And so in that case, the bound actually, it doesn't make sense for it to be static because over time, you'll be wasting a lot more time waiting to accumulate more evidence for a stimulus that is, not really, coherent, right? And so it predicts the collapsing bound more from the fact that you're trying to maximize reward as opposed to, the predictive coding model was just looking at a sensory aspect, right? It was just looking at sensory prediction. But I think what you're getting at maybe more has to do with the gain matrix I talked about. It was a filtering matrix for the prediction error, right? I mean, that has some...
If you have very little prediction and but then suddenly you
Yes.
lower, then you get the reward, this would be much higher because then you don't have such a higher.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't looked at connecting, reward signals to the sort of the sensory prediction aspect, right? So potentially you could be learning some of those basis filters to fine-tune them to maximize your reward function, right? So it could be that you're actually optimizing it completely as one coherent system, and that's where your question would make sense, would be where you have one coherent, I mean, the integrated system, and the Bayesian inference part is not separate from the reward maximization part, right? I mean, in this case, we were actually assuming they were separate, and we're saying, okay, Bayesian inference is doing its thing, and then that input gets fed to the reward maximization circuits in the basal ganglia and so on. But I think what you're saying is there's actually a potential to even use the reward maximization and reward prediction errors to fine-tune the weights of the predictive coding circuit, right? Which is actually an interesting idea. Yeah.
I saw another hand earlier. No? Other questions for Raj?
Okay.
So, in terms of prediction error, what do you think the benefit of doing multiple level predictions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, so what are the benefit of doing multiple level predictions, right? So, when we were doing the original model there, the idea was that the receptive fields of V1 neurons are limited in terms of their the number of degrees that they span, and so we were trying to look at contextual effects, which is what is the effect of a bigger contextual context that you're providing. And so the idea was that you could actually use the larger receptive fields at the higher level, like in V2, to actually learn the statistics over a bigger spatial extent, and then use that to make a prediction at the lower level and then guide the inference going on at the lower level, right? So the idea of having multiple levels there is that the higher levels are going to be learning the statistics of natural, in this case, natural videos, right? Or both space and time, but doing it at a longer time scale and also at a larger spatial extent. So that as you go higher and higher up, right, you have bigger spatial receptive fields, you have longer temporal receptive fields, and then those in turn are modulating the responses at the lower level. So each level is learning the statistics at different levels of abstraction, right? And then the prediction error is just a way to update the estimate. So every time that you make a prediction, you always want to be able to verify the hypotheses, right? And so the error signal is letting you verify the hypothesis and correct your estimate at each level of abstraction.
So this is more like a straightforward kind of view of this stuff, right? So let's see, for the first 100 milliseconds, the first sweep of information goes from primary to let's see the higher IP error, right? So the next, let's see, 200 milliseconds, 100 milliseconds, there's like a feedback coming back, right? So
Well, that's assuming that you're in a dark room and somebody's flashing something at you, right? Whereas in a natural circumstance, you always have some expectation. When I entered the room, I had some expectation of what this was going to look like. And then when I'm talking to apps, I have some expectation of what you're going to say, right? So I think the actual way that the system might be operating is always in that mode of prediction expectation. So there's always something that you're expecting, and then so it's not that there's this feed forward path that goes through. It has to go through all the layers and then it has to come back again. I mean, that's a very, I think, restricted way of looking at it. It's actually only going to happen in a very laboratory kind of situation. But in the natural circumstance, I think the way that it would actually work would be, it's always happening, right? It's always got some expectation. I mean, ultimately it comes from memory, right? So it comes from the hippocampus. You have some short-term memory. It's actually giving you that guidance as to what to expect and setting up the expectations. And then as you coming with the information, is always updating itself. So, so one of the key things there is time, right? So it really helps you make your decision making really fast, right? Because you're always setting up those expectations. So that's one of the advantages, I think, of having the predictions, is that it lets you do really quick, fast decision making, which may not be possible if you're doing a full feed forward pass and then doing the feedback later.
One
Okay.
technical question. At least in the original predictive coding, like with backpropagation, you have a perfect transpose of the,
Yeah,
of the
right,
weight matrix.
right.
I'm curious if you've checked whether this, just a random matrix like Blumenkraft at all, whether it works pretty well.
Yeah. So I think the transpose matrix, right? So I guess I don't want to bring it up right now, but I guess I could. So basically, the transpose one, it just comes about from the derivation, right, of the of this equation there. So that U transpose there, it just comes about because you're trying to minimize the errors, the squared errors, right? And so it comes from the math, right? But then you can ask, okay, biologically, is that plausible, right? So that I think is an interesting question, right? And it also comes about because there is a learning rule. So if you apply you can derive a learning rule for the use, and when you derive the learning rules for the use, you can show that you can also learn the transpose of the matrix at the same time that you're learning the use. So people have actually have done that even before we did this work. People are looking at how can you learn the transposes of matrices when you're learning one matrix, right? So there are learning rules which are Hebbian that actually do kind of converge to one being the transpose of the other. But I think the interesting question is this might not be the unique solution, right? So as long as the matrices that you pick, right, allow you to converge to the optimal estimate, then it should be fine, right? Because ultimately what we're doing here is figuring out what are the dynamics of the network that will optimally estimate the state, right? This R hat is basically your best estimate of the state. And you're doing that in the context of the matrix U and U transpose, which are the learned synapses, right? Those are like those are the kind of internal model of the world in terms of, in this case, these basis functions, right? So if you pick a different set of basis functions and they're not transposes of each other, then the R might not necessarily be given by this equation, right? It might be a different equation, maybe a nonlinear neural network, right? Some dynamics that give you the R. But it's possible, yeah.
Anything else for Raj? If not, let's thank him again.
All right, thank you. Oh, thank you.